Good afternoon, everyone. I am Eirik Hovden, a researcher at Arabic Department of Foreign Languages, UIB, and I'm the project leader of the TMS starting grant called CanCode, Canonization and Codification of Islamic Law. The last few years, our local academic environment here at UIB for the study of Middle East and the Islamic tradition has seen a surge of activity with two larger research projects, namely the CanCode project on Islamic law and the mPrint project about the transition from manuscript to print on the East African coast, led by Professor Ahmed. And together, we have a large group of PhD students, postdocs, and researchers. And over the last few years, we have had several guest researchers and guest lecturers. But in the row of distinguished guests we have had so far, today's guest lecturer stands remarkably out for us. That's because he is invited by both these two research projects, and he has the highest expertise and has published two seminal monographs in both fields of these two research projects. So it's just a great honor to welcome Professor Ahmed El Shamsy here to Bergen and to be able to have him here for a couple of days. Ahmed El Shamsy has a PhD from Harvard and is now professor and department chair at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. For the sake of time, I will not go into detail about his research focus and his many publications, and I will soon give the word to him. But first, a little bit of practical information. I would like to remind you to check the upcoming program at the research group called Center for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. And we also post most of our events that are relevant for the broader public in a Facebook group called Middle East, Arabic and Islamic Studies in Bergen. And the next upcoming event will be on June the 10th with Lucia Carminati talking about labor migration and the making of the Suez Canal. For this event today, we have 1 hour in total. And there will be some time at the end for questions and comments. So Professor Ahmed El Shamsy, chair is yours.
Thank you very much, Eirik, for introducing me. I'm really sorry for being a little bit late, but it was just so invigorating to swim in the sea here that I just forgot about time. So the topic of my talk today is a topic that I've been interested in for a number of years, and I've done research on in the last couple of weeks. So parts of this talk I've given before, but it also contains some updates. So to begin with something that doesn't sound at all kind of connected to the study of Islam, in the mid-19th century, the German scholar Konstantin Tischendorf, at that point he was not a von yet, went to the St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt and discovered there the so-called Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest almost complete copy of the Bible, Old and New Testament together. And the story that he told about his discovery and the subsequent taking of this codex with him to Europe, part of it, the largest part, is in the British Museum now. It's one of the centerpieces of their collection. Part of it is at the University of Leipzig, and part of it in St. Petersburg, is that he found this codex not as a complete copy, but as a series of pages in, as he describes it, a waste paper basket in the monastery. And he says that he had seen monks taking stuff out of there and using it as using it to burn in the oven. And so he rescued this manuscript and took it with him, I mean, against the will or without the permission of the monks. And it's one of those stories that you hear, one of those founding myths of Oriental scholarship that people just reproduce, like with a straight face, and where I always thought, surely that can't be right. Surely it can't be that this guy went there in the 1850s and they had looked after this manuscript for almost 2,000 years and they were about to burn it and he just came in and then he like, well, what's the likelihood of that happening? So to me, it just felt like it can't, none of this can be right? But as we'll see, maybe partly it isn't wrong. We'll see. So what is the life cycle of a book in the pre-modern Muslim world? And I promise there's a connection to what I just said a moment ago. What is the life cycle of an Arabic manuscript? And if we look at it in a kind of simplified way, we start with authors writing their works. So this is in a preprint world. This is in a world of manuscripts in which people wrote it by hand. This is in a world in which paper has been introduced. So from the 8th century onwards, we have authors writing works. We have copyists, either private people who want to copy the book for themselves or professional copyists. They get their material from a stationer like a warraq in Arabic. A paper person, literally. And then these books end up in private libraries and also in public libraries or publicly accessible libraries. Right? And then some of them, of course, disappear. Some, somehow get destroyed. We have stories of wars, fires, insect infestation. That's a big deal in the pre-modern world. Paper gets eaten by worms and stuff. And then they end up in modern libraries. So in the 19th century, a lot of Muslim countries, 19th and early 20th century Muslim countries basically forcefully unify their manuscript libraries in a single on a small number of publicly available libraries. And of course, also a large number of manuscripts get taken and or bought by European libraries and Western libraries and end up in Western libraries. And at each of these stages, loss can happen. Right? And what I want to do actually at the end, but by the end of the talk, have a kind of a bit more sophisticated image of how this life cycle works. So to start, when I wrote my most recent book about rediscovering the Islamic classics, I came across a quote by the most important Egyptian historian of the 19th century, Al-Jabarti, very famous for his account of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And at the beginning of his history, he lists the Arabic historical tradition that he's very proud of and that he's aware of. More than 1,000 years of history writing. All these books that we know, all these books that I have in my library. And then at the end of it, he says this very strange thing. He says, well, none of these books are actually extant anymore to him at this point, except as scattered fragments. And there's this term, ajza mudashata, which I found strange because it's not proper, it's not classical Arabic. Mudashata, what exactly does that mean? I translated it kind of correctly, like shooting from the hip, so to speak. But it was like, I didn't quite understand what he actually meant with this until after I'd published the book. And I was asked to give a talk about a beautiful little library in Jerusalem called the Khalidiyya Library. From the in the possession of the Khalidi family, and the holdings of this library are digitized. You can look them up on the web, and I looked at the oldest catalog that they have, written in about 1900, and at the end of it, here what's in yellow, there is an addition at the end, like an addendum, where it says there is more titles that this one scholar, Tahir al-Jazairi, had reconstructed from the dashed. Yeah. Now, I was wondering, what does this mean, dashed? Dashed is not, strictly speaking, an Arabic word. It comes from Persian. In Persian, it means desert. So what exactly did he do? But dashed and ajza mudashata that Jabarti used, that's the same root. So what are we talking about here? So when we think about a library, when we think about a manuscript library, we kind of think about the thing here on the right-hand side, right? Bound copies of works that kind of look like normal books, just maybe a little bit not as neat as this. In fact, this is a little bit misleading because, of course, the classic Arabic library, the books weren't like this. They were on top of each other like this. But anyway, so on the right-hand side, these are bound books. On the left-hand side, you can see these individual pages. That's what happens if the binding deteriorates. Yeah? Bindings are weaker. Paper is not, they didn't have acid-free paper at the time, right? So things deteriorate and books fall apart, and then they are individual pages or parts of fragments of a book. And from this phenomenon, already we can already find this in the medieval period, that libraries had a corner where you kept these books that had disintegrated. In the medieval period, they were called mahrum, the plural is maharim. In fact, in contemporary North Africa, if you go to Morocco, they're still called kharm or khurm, and khurum is the plural. That's the, Konrad Hirschler calls it the messy corner of a library. So where unfortunately, some of you can't quite see this because of my, thank you. In the contemporary Middle East, i.e., definitely at least Egypt and Syria, this is referred to as dashed. So that is the place where books that have fallen apart are kept, that are not anymore on the, they're not anymore coherent, and they're not anymore on the shelves. And in fact, kharm and khurum now in Egypt, for example, or in Syria, it means a lacuna within a manuscript. If there's a hole, if there's a white space, that's what it means now. And here, just on the right, it's just a Twitter exchange where a Moroccan scholar announces that he has found something in the khurum, and then this Nawal Al-Khayyat, I don't know where she's from, but not from North Africa, she's asking, what do you mean with khurum? Do you mean dashed? But he never answered her tweet. Just following this up, if you look at the 19th century lexicographical tradition, Boutros al-Bustani in Lebanon mentions, yes, dashed, the traditional lexicographical explanation, dashed in Persian means desert, but he already mentions that in colloquial Arabic at his time, they used dashed to mean something that is abandoned. And then we move here to the early 20th century, Ahmed Taymour, famous Egyptian intellectual, also a great collector of manuscripts. He says it's a technical term for mixed up and jumbled papers. So that is already definitely, by that time, they used the term dashed to refer to that phenomenon in manuscript libraries, not just public libraries, also and individual libraries. So people had at home, they had a dashed. Normally it's like a basket or a cabin or a box where they keep these individual pages. So just to go back to the idea of the life cycle of a manuscript, to go through the various possibility of what happens when a book falls apart, an old book falls apart. The first possibility is the book gets rebound. So this is an example here that I worked on with my students recently. This is a manuscript that is kept in Istanbul, and you can see clearly on the margins, you can see the original here, this here, right, this page. And then, unfortunately, not very well, this has been rebound, but at least it is rebound. You can see it's not high quality binding, but it is a single volume that at some point somebody looked at this poor manuscript and made it, remade it into a book that could be read. The second possibility is that you reuse the paper to make paste boards, i.e. make new bindings for new books. So you can see this here. Some of when the bindings start to break, you can actually see in it all the pages. And so in fact, all the bindings are the source of old manuscripts. People are discovering older manuscripts in the bindings of later books. Now let's get back to the Codex Sinaiticus. After people realized that there's this incredibly important work that existed in the St. Catherine's Library, they looked for more fragments. You know, they kept finding new fragments, and they found some fragments who had become, who had been used in the bindings of newer books in the St. Catherine's Monastery. Right? You might be starting to get where I want to go with this, right? Third possibility is turning it into recycling, recycling it as wrapping paper. So Jurji Zaidan, famous Lebanese writer of historical fiction, has an account that's a little bit triggering to scholars of manuscripts, but he describes that some caretakers of mosques sold loose papers to fruit sellers and greengrocers to wrap their products in. Obviously, this is not a picture of that, but just to think about this, how many books we've lost to, you know, falafel or something like this, falafel wrapping. Now, these dushut is the plural of dasht, also existed among booksellers. So booksellers bought these individual pages to reuse them. Right? So booksellers were also recyclers of paper, and they used these pages to make bindings, for example. But you could also go just to buy used paper there, and we have an example here where Muhyiddin al-Khatib, a famous Syrian intellectual, publisher, nationalist, etc., goes to Mecca in 1918 and goes to a bookseller, and there he discovers the only known fragment of this book by Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, one of the most important Arabic poet of all time, in the dasht, in the loose paper collection at a bookseller's place. Again, this word appears, and it's like as if I had never known before what this is, right? Once you know it, then you suddenly see it everywhere. So what I did last week, last Friday and then Saturday, is I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and I wanted to see how they deal with fragments. You know, they have a large Arabic manuscript collection, so I was thinking, well, what do you do with it? And it turns out they are binding all the fragments into volumes. They're obviously not real volumes, as you can see. These are just like individual pages bound together. They have only 4 volume of fragments. It's understandable that both that they have the resources that if they have a full book that disintegrates, that they keep rebinding it, and at the same time, they're not necessarily buying individual loose pages. So given that it's a relatively recent and a very well-financed library, I didn't expect to find many, but in fact, I found significant stuff. So this is just a picture to give you an idea. But just to see what is in these fragments, really interesting, fascinating things. So this is a document written in 1665 in Castilian and Arabic. Right? It's a document with witnesses, etc. I'm not an expert. I don't know what it means. I have friends I've sent this to, but these are not just books that have fallen apart, but there is more to these fragment libraries. So there's also a document. It's also a type of archive, right? It's an archive that also contains documents. I had suspected this, but this is evidence here. Second thing, an amulet from Sawakin in Sudan, Sudanese port. This is written on cloth, about 1/2 meter wide. Also there. A court document from the 7th century of the Hijra. on parchment. So not paper, but animal skin. It's the oldest document of that kind I've seen. Very interesting from the Ayyubid period, either from Egypt or Syria. Very interesting stuff. Again, here, what you see here is that this is about 15 pages. So this is not just individual pages, but this is kind of a subsection of a book that still, you can see here, there's still part of the binding still attached. It's a smaller format. And this is, I sent that to a friend who's an expert in Islamic medicine. And as you can see here, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the most important translator of Greek classics into Arabic, but who also wrote works in medicine. And to the knowledge of my colleague, this is an unknown fragment of Hunayn ibn Ishaq. So this is a major find. And it took me like 37 minutes in this fragment collection to find it. So this is this phenomenon is a phenomenon that we find in the accounts of the formation of modern libraries. We find that quite a bit. So this is a journal article from Al-Muqtataf, the journal, about the formation of the Al-Azhar library in Cairo. So Al-Azhar had various sub-libraries, and in the 1890s, they brought them together into one library. And so these individual sub-libraries, each one of them had a dasht. And this is just an account where some of these people are getting, some of the people who have to go through this and who are carrying out bundles and bundles of loose pages, at a certain point they're saying, shall we just get rid of this stuff? Shall we just burn it all? Thank God they didn't. But you can see this this challenge of these libraries, these long-established libraries with a lot of manuscripts, who by the late 19th century, a lot of their books have fallen apart. These are endowed libraries. Very often, these endowments stipulated that a bookbinder would be paid from this endowment. But by the 19th century, a lot of these endowments had lapsed, and people had not, hadn't bound the old books for a long time. So there was a lot of material in that type of state. Something I found in the actual proper manuscript collection in the Dar al-Kutub in the Egyptian National Library is that you find on the margins entries. So this is an entry from the 1890s where it says Mustakhraj min Dasht al-Mu'ayyad. So this was extracted from the Dasht of the specific Mu'ayyad collection that they brought in the National Library. So as I said, each of these medieval libraries that were united had a dasht, and then once it was brought to the Egyptian library, people worked on it and put together either complete codices or at least large fragments, and then returned them to the main library, right, to the shelves. And so that is the note that denotes that. Right? So I got interested in what is going on with the Egyptian National Library today. I went there 2 weeks ago now, and unfortunately, I did not get access to their dasht, but they do have it. So I interviewed the director of the manuscript library, and the reason why he didn't allow me access, which is understandable in the sense, is that these fragments are the most sensitive part of the library. This is the most fragile material, and none of this is even cataloged. Egyptian National Library was established in 1870. He said, this stuff still is not cataloged. Right? So this is so he described it to me. He said it's a room of 8 × 6 meters with shelves. On the shelves there are like the larger fragments, where maybe only the cover page is missing or something like this. And therefore they don't know what it is. And then there are a lot of boxes just with loose pages in it. And there's 3 people working on it. One is working on the Arabic material, one on the Persian material, one on the Turkish material. And he said they have just started separating them by topic. So there seems to be a lot of work still to be done. And I asked the person who's working on the Arabic, and I asked him, so do you have documents in there as well? And he said, how did you know? I said, I have a feeling. I had a feeling about that. So I'm still continuing, visiting libraries, making connections, and trying to find out more what exactly these dushut contain. Now, when looking for references of these dushut, I came across this rather interesting anecdote from the Zahiriya library in Damascus, which is basically the equivalent of the Egyptian National Library in Syria. And it is an account of a former head librarian who, once he took over the management of the Zahiriya, walked around, asked, "What is this? What is this?" And he came to a room and he said, "What is this? Open this door." And they said, "We can't open this door." It's like, why everybody's calling you now? Did something happen? Did the Norwegian hockey team win or lose? Or they said that we can't open this door. And they said, "Why can't we open this door?" And he says, "Well, this is a little room with a door, and it has a little window on top. And we used to put the loose pages in the room. And at a certain point, it was too difficult to put it in the room, so we just threw it through the window. And then at some point, the stuff collapsed and it blocked the door. And so we just kept throwing stuff in there, but we couldn't open the door anymore, right?" So then he had it open, and a lot of stuff has, again, happened with this dash. But I'm just thinking, this is an interesting story because it kind of reminds you of the Geniza, right? If you know something about the Geniza, this is the next slide. Geniza is a phenomenon in which, well, the so-called Cairo Geniza, in which in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, there was discovered in the late 19th century a small room in which the Jewish community over a long period had discarded loose pages. And at a certain point, kind of forgotten about it, or it hadn't, and then rediscovered it. And then this collection was spread all over the place, particularly went to Cambridge, also to places like St. Petersburg, again, and other places, and has become a major source of history, not just of Jews in the Middle East, but also of the Middle East in general, because they also used, it contains not just things related to the Jewish community, also documents from the Fatimid collection, Arabic literature, etc., etc. So the question is, what is the connection? Are these similar phenomena of storing pages that are not quite usable anymore, but that you don't quite want to get rid of? I mean, one of the hypotheses is that there's both in Judaism and Islam a hesitancy to disregard writing, because both Hebrew and Arabic is a sacred, the script is kind of considered to be a sacred phenomenon. But maybe there's also a bit more of a practical dimension to it, i.e. this is just a room of storing stuff that you don't quite know what to do. You can't quite use anymore as a library, but maybe in the future you'll deal with it. I have that in my bedroom. There's a corner where I put those pages that I don't want to deal with right now. And like every couple of months, my wife tells me, "You really should deal with these." So in a sense, when we return to this life cycle that I showed at the beginning, we see that fragments kind of complicate this issue, right? We have the possibility of fragments emerging, and then ways in which where these fragments can go. They can go back into kind of circulation through stationers, or they can just be stored in specific designated places. So in terms of conclusions, I consider this dasht as a phenomenon. I mean, in a sense, of course, this is a universal phenomenon, right? Every library has to deal with this, but there's something particular about these dushut in the Middle Eastern context, as an in-between state where written material goes. It hasn't quite died yet. It's not quite alive anymore, but it can stay there, and it can be a place where we can find this material. Unfortunately, this material is generally invisible to the researcher. So it's not in catalogs, right? You look at a library collection, it is not in the, it will not be in the catalog. And in more recent moves to digitize these collections, it will also not be digitized. So when I looked at the Khalidiyya collection, it's all digitized except the Dasht. The Dasht is not digitized. So if you think, well, why should I go to Jerusalem? Everything is online. Not everything is online. And so it's the invisible part of the library. Second question, what is the connection between the Dasht and other library phenomena like the Geneza and like this phenomenon in the St. Catherine's Monastery? Are we actually talking about the same phenomenon? Might this help us to think through these practices of Middle Eastern book culture more broadly? And in that sense, first of all, as a public service announcement to researchers to always keep an eye out for the fragments, because they might, in a sense, the books that fall apart, I mean, it could be the books that are least well made, but very often it's the oldest books. And that is actually true. Some of the oldest books originally came from a Dasht. And so if there are books, like the one sin one should not commit is to say, oh, this book is not extant anymore. This is a book we haven't found yet, and there might be fragments that can still be found around the world. And for those of us who are engaged in digitization efforts, to keep an eye on this. And in fact, the point I made to the director of the Egyptian National Library, because he said to me, like, this is so much material, there's no way we can do this. We were just like, I said, well, digitization would be the way to do it. You can crowdsource it. You can use, because he said, like, how do you identify like a page or half a page or even smaller pieces? You need to have experts on every field. I say, if you crowdsource it, you might find experts from all fields who are interested in this. Finally, as a kind of, in connection to recent phenomena, the only place I have found that actually has digitized a Dasht is this Endangered Archives program at the British Library. And kind of the one Dasht that they did digitize and put online early last year is the Dasht of the El Omari Mosque in Gaza, which, if you look at what happened to the Omari Mosque at the end of last year, these are the remaining ruins, and the manuscripts had been transferred to the Ministry of Endowments. At least some of those buildings have also been leveled. So this is just a reminder of how fragile these fragments are, what fragile witnesses to the past they are, and how important it is to maintain it, not to lose this essential part of Middle Eastern book culture. So thank you very much.
Professor Ahmed, for this fascinating presentation. So we actually have quite much time for questions and comments. Yeah, let's start in the back. Aiden, the microphone is on its way.
Hello, and thank you very much for the talk. I have two parts, and one is a kind of thank you to say that when you were telling von Tischendorf's story, it was like a cut and paste story from the Italian humanists and their kind of discovery of things. And I thought, oh, maybe instead of finding things under cobwebs that were totally destroyed, they were finding things that were waiting to be rebound or actually taken care of. The question I have is about what I saw were in your fragments were a lot of single page fragments. And so I'm wondering about the binding itself, that there weren't a lot of what I would call bifolia, but two ends of the pages that were kept together, and I didn't see a lot of cut pieces that would indicate kind of working with them and using them in certain ways afterwards. So is that typical, and does that say anything about the binding? I don't know that much about the binding process of Eastern books, so that's kind of why I'm asking.
So there are, I showed this one larger part from this medical work. There are several of those. They are less attractive, visually attractive. That's why I didn't show you the pictures of it. But at least in the Bodleian, the majority are single pages. And and these documents are just documents, and some of them are like, they bound them in one volume, but then you open the thing and then it's like, and it's actually that long. So there's a document that is that wide and that long. So really kind of different ways in which documents were written and formats in which people wrote documents. So that question of to what extent, like I haven't even worked out like what is the percentage between single page documents and actual fragments of books in this. And okay, I should have shown you this. Like even finding out where does this stuff come from. So this is the Bodleian Library. There are individual pages by librarians with handwritten notes. And most of these notes are unreadable. I should have shown you, like it looked like the guy had a stroke while he was writing this note. And I walked around the library, like, can you help me read this? And people are like, they're like, I don't even know which way to hold this. So massive loss of information of how this stuff came, together. Where it came from, was this just people saying, hi, look, I have this, I found from my grandfather this basket of whatever, here, have it, Bodleian Library. And that's how it came up. Or was that, like, these documents, were they did somebody use that as a reading mark or something like this? I don't know how that ended up in the Bodleian Library. With the fragments, it's more, what one can think about this more, but I'm following up one hint that there might be part of like one work, part of it is in Cambridge, is in Cambridge, and part of it is in Oxford. But yeah, I'm still investigating.
Anna?
Thank you, Ahmed, for this lecture and for alerting us to all the fragments, which, of course, in the Imprint project, we do encounter them all the time, and they are first and foremost a cataloging nightmare, obviously, from my point of view exactly. But I wanted to raise a kind of big question, which I have been pondering and which I maybe is less relevant to collections that are public, like the ones that you describe, but at certain points in time, including, let's say, then the Geniza, somehow, people will turn to the dashed to look for something. And of course, nowadays, primarily that would be looking for broadly defined heritage, whatever. Because it was written by my grandfather, or at some point also people will presumably seek out fragments in order to look for text, for information, for something to read or teach. I'm wondering if you have any sense of how these kind of the usage of fragments, even though they end up behind a closed door, which cannot be opened.
Well, it really depends. If you look at the history of how the Geniza was used, I'm obviously not an expert, but you read like Goitein, and it's very much, this is his main book is called The Mediterranean Society. So this is a history of the Jewish community, you can write with these documents. While in recent years, it's like, oh, look at all those connections to other communities. So it's the same corpus of texts. It's just a different interest at specific, histories and time. And so as always, the questions that you ask from the material is historically specific, and the problem with these invisible archives that are invisibly existing in libraries is that if you have an open library, then different people can make different things out of it. While the fact that most people don't even know it exists. Even if you could access it, they don't know it exists, because also the cataloging is, first of all, the one with the Bodleian, there was nothing in the catalog. I had to ask the librarian to tell me that there are these bound volumes. He had also no idea what was in them. So even if they're openly accessible, people don't know about them. And then most of the time, they're not even publicly accessible. So then they're really subject to either total neglect or the very specific interests of whoever is in charge of these things. And in these national libraries, very often there is, people are just kind of overworked. They're not particularly motivated by grander intellectual interests. So I can't. I mean, the Dasht in Damascus, Nasiruddin al-Albani, the famous kind of Salafi Hadith scholar, he discovered this Dasht for himself. Like, he was a guy who sat in the Zahiriya library every day for decades and kept, bugging the librarian. Like, there was this one book where only 2 volumes survived. And he was like, surely there must be the 3rd volume. Where's the 3rd volume? And at some point, the guy says, look, we have a room with like pages in it. You can have a look at there. And so then he had access to it. And he massively discovered stuff in there and added it to so that in the catalog, there's like a specific sign for him, while Albani, like the stuff that Albani discovered, just because he was a nerd who gained the trust of the librarians. And he had a particular interest in hadith works, but a lot of these works were discovered by him. They were not in the general collections. So as with so many things, it's the kind of the motivation of individuals, of obsessed individuals that structures so much of what becomes visible.
Alexandros?
Yes, thank you, Eirik, and thank you, Professor, for this very interesting talk. I have 2 hats when I'm here. The one is as a nubiologist, and the other is as academic manager of the part of the special collection that has a collection of Arabic manuscripts. So beginning with that, it seems to me that in the formation of archives in colonial or para-colonial milieus like the ones that are stakeholders of these manuscripts in the West and in the North, the notion of dust might be a very interesting way of speaking about our possessions, and I would like to have your comment on that. Then, as a nubiologist, I would like to go back to Anna's question, because in Nubia, all the manuscripts from the medieval times in Greek, Coptic, Old Nubian, and in Arabic, they are found in fragmentary state. They come from the archaeological context. And in this context, you often wonder whether they were found as fragments because they were demolished in the course of time, or because at one point or another, the fragments were still in use. I think that I have shown in my PhD that in the case of a peripheral church with the second largest cassette of manuscripts, the fragments from the medieval time were fragments that were indeed used by a community after the fall and disintegration of the Christian kingdoms, and while the church was still somehow being used as the religious center of the community on that island of Sur. So I think that in terms of finding inspiration in these fragments for spiritual guidance of the flock around, my answer to Anne from that example would be yes. And I wonder if more specifically in such an archaeological contextualization, you would feel the same. Then again, excellent idea of comparing the Sinaiticus with the Geniza and the dust materials. The question might be whether behind these uses, there is also this obligation or uncertainty as to what do we do with religious texts when they can be discarded, but actually cannot. Again, another point of perhaps discussion. And then last, as an anecdote, this using of manuscripts for warming up, making fire, actually is also, as I guess many of you have heard, the story behind the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices. So I think that there are quite interesting parallels to see in the way, again, the West managed to excuse our possession of these treasures of others.
Yeah. Thank you. So again, like as every academic, when you write your CV, you make it sound like, oh, I had planned this all out in advance, but in reality, it just all happened by accident or chance or whatever, fate maybe. So a couple of years ago, I wrote an article on Muslim discussions of what to do with sacred texts if they can't be used anymore. Yeah, I found it very interesting to actually go into the details of these discussions, which were never quite settled. There's an early precedent of actually burning copies of the Quran, that's an acceptable way of getting rid of it, washing it off, but then also very early burying, and then this idea, this metaphor came up that the body of a unusable Quran is like the body of a corpse, and you have to do the same. You have to treat it with the same dignity as you treat the corpse, and you bury it the same way. And so that there's a intellectual history of collections. We have the closest to the Geniza that evidence that we have is this place called the Qubatul Khazna in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which is, if you've ever been there, seen pictures, it's like a separate room that's like on 4 stilts in the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque, where they kept fragments of all kinds of stuff, including, Arabic stuff. Some of the oldest fragments of the Quran were found in there, but also Old French and Latin and Greek stuff in there. And then when the Allies approached Damascus at the end of World War I, the Ottoman troops actually took all this material with them to Istanbul, and it's now part of the Islamic Museum in Istanbul, and it's not open for study. And it's probably at least as big as the Geniza in terms of the material. We have only very little information about it, but that would be like a new frontier of studying all kind of aspects of Middle Eastern history. If it's like a Gordian knot connected to Turkish bureaucracy and museum rules to kind of get access to this, but there is an enormous amount of things that we can material for knowing, but that has not been approached because kind of the history of, in a sense, of Orientalism is very much of it's very much of a philological tradition that is not necessarily paying attention to the materiality of books and of fragments. And I think there is a lot to be. There are these kind of straight papyrologists, for example, who all they just do is just describe papyri and just decipher some lacunae. And then there's historians who just deal with printed material. And I think now there's really an exciting kind of new generation of historians who take these things together, kind of movement of book history also in Western book history that is interesting, and that's also affecting Middle Eastern studies. So I have great hopes for the future, but exactly these sensitivities of let's not just look at a book as what the author thought, but also how was this book used and reused, and how were, I mean, even after it had ceased to be a book, how were the fragments used, and what was the meaning given to it? All of these layers of history are only recently kind of given any attention to.
I didn't. Yeah.
Oh, I forget about this thing. Okay. In your discussion, there are a couple of, I don't know what you call it, polarities, either ors, dichotomies. That is, the dashed on one hand can be the most discarded material. On the other hand, it can also be the most valuable material. So what I was wondering, and this is kind of a shot in the dark, is if there's any way of thinking of the range of circumstances or kind of a typology for why things end up in this state. Because on the one hand, as you hinted at or said, actually, the books that were most used would likely have the bindings that were most worn, which goes counter to the idea of, oh, this is material that we don't need anymore. So I'm just kind of like, and so I can go from those 2 points, like this was very valuable stuff that has become worn or disused with age, or this is not valuable stuff. But are there kind of things in between those two, extremes?
I mean, this is also comes down to the question of valuable for who and at what point. So I think one of the main points of my more recent book is that books that were classics at some point, at a certain point stopped being read, and then were rediscovered and again read widely. And this can happen, and this is what, that's what makes written material different from oral material, which oral material, once it ceases being relevant, you forget about it, and then you can't recover it. While written material, you can forget about it for all intents and purposes, and then remember it after generations. And so that might be, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so interesting that it can fall out of a tradition, and generations forget about it. It's not cited anymore. And there's no need, and people don't see a need to rebind this stuff. And then, maybe it's still, maybe it's just missing the binding, and then you put it in a box, and then you put other pages on it, and people look through it, and then suddenly it's mixed up, and then suddenly you can't find, then you actually really need to do a proper, excavation to find these pages again. And then libraries move from place to place. So even the Egyptian National Library has moved several times. So that's actually interesting. The members of the current team at the Dar al-Qutb, they believed that was the only reason why there was a dasht. They thought it's just because we moved a couple of times, so like the stuff fell apart during the moves. And I'm like, oh, but already in the original libraries you had a dasht, and they didn't know about that either. So like, even there's no institutional memory on this. There's this problem room, which is the dasht, but what's the history of that? We also don't know. Again, part of the problem is that it's just it falls through the cracks of the category of the library somehow, right? The library is the things that is here, accessible, and we see, but then there's behind the scenes, there's stuff going on, and it's not necessarily taught as a part of the library process what to do at this point. And as I said, you can find in endowed libraries, you can find the jobs of how to deal with books that are deteriorating, but that's such a specialized thing that if you have to cut costs, then that's probably the first thing, it's the first costs you cut. And we know that by the time that, I mean, one of the reasons why these modern national libraries were established is that these libraries were, for all intents and purposes, defunct. There was no librarians anymore, or the as the story goes, at the Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo, the librarian also sold sugarcane juice to make a living, and if you paid a little bit more for sugarcane juice, you got an extra manuscript on top of that. You can imagine various you can also imagine that these monks just took out the useless stuff out of this dash to burn it, but they had some sort of maybe there were just several boxes. Or I don't know. I mean, I don't think we can really reconstruct this. I've been in contact with the St. Catherine's Monastery, but they also have, they have no internal material on this. They only know what Tischendorf said, and they're upset about it because the guy took our most valuable book and claimed that he just borrowed it. Like, what does that mean? Like, can I borrow this book? I'll bring it back. What does that mean in the 19th century to say this? They're interested in my research, but it's not that they have any material of their own to participate in, like, active. Maybe in the future, you can do research in their collection, maybe to find out more evidence of this happening with other books, that kind of usage. But at the moment, there's just speculation.
I think we have 2 questions left. One from the front here, and then Alexandros. Okay, very, very brief, because we
check the Sinai material that the Byzantine Museum of Athens have dug out of the walls.
Oh, no.
So that's the 80s, 90s. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact recollection now, but the report that goes that the monks did works, found a hidden room behind the walled wall, and in there the cassette was discovered, which is comparable to the Geniza, with fragments of codices and individual fragments, which are extremely important for the story of the Sinai monastery. So this is publication. I think it's both in Greek and in English.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I will be very brief. I have a very simple question, but it is important, I think, that it is about the principles of handling manuscripts. I was in the advertisement for this the lecture. There was a photo. I don't think it was you, but it was, you see, on the person with hands, and the hands has gloves.
Yeah.
In my opinion, the wisdom of using gloves in handling manuscripts is dubious. I am against it, because you need the paper, you need the sensibility, the fingertips in the field, and this disappears with the gloves. And there's one important library which is of the same fields. It's the Forschungsbibliothek. I was there in September last year, and I looked at the manuscript, admittedly only 17th century, but not very old, by Friedrich Brechtley. And I asked about it. Do you not demand that I use? No, we don't use it here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to hear what do you need?
Yeah, absolutely. I would never use gloves, and I think that is also the latest. The latest, because you don't have this, you're also rougher with it. You're not actually nicer to the paper. You actually have more. There's more danger of you actually damaging it. And to be honest, the reason why, like, I fell in love with manuscripts just by accident, but it's just a sensual, like, there's a central experience of a handwritten text that you don't have with a printed book. Printed book is just a product of a machine, stamping stuff on paper. But this is like one person sat down and wrote this with their hand, and you see the, you see the process, and you see the individuality, and touching it, and touching paper, good paper, fine paper, rough paper, animal hide, cloth, that just like that's his experiencing something about it that goes far beyond just just what is written.
I think that's an excellent way of ending this super interesting lecture of yours. So again, a big applause for Ahmed.
Thank you for coming.